Corruption. Who doesn't love a little bit of corruption in their life? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your status in society, corruption has existed in different forms throughout history. I could spend 10 minutes giving you, well, a history lesson about corruption, but I'm assuming you probably already know what that is, so I'm going to save us both the time. What I would like to instead say right now, though, is whatever corruption is, we can say what it's not, and that is the corruption mechanic in EU4. Right, before we get into the video, just a quick intermission to say that a like would be appreciated and a subscription would be amazing if you haven't already. 15k has been achieved, so let's keep that momentum up. It's time for 16k. Anyway, enough self-shitting. Let's begin. Firstly, what does corruption do at 0? Well, nothing. Technically, when it is low, you do get good corruption events. These are events you've probably seen quite a few times if you've played EU4. Things like the honest merchants giving you global trade power, some state maintenance from trust your neighbor, rigorous researchers if give you 40 of each monarch point. That one is quite nice. But it does require your corruption to be below 0. It needs to be not increasing, your stability to be 3. So that one's quite hard to get. And things like honorable people. So again, you get some pretty nice events if it's really low, as in literally below 1. Otherwise, kind of does nothing at 0. At 100% though, it's a completely different story. You do get negative corruption events. Those aren't great, that's for certain. But you also get a whole bunch of modifiers scaling with the amount of corruption you have. For whatever reason, being really corrupt decreases your national unrest. And let's just sit down for a moment and think about this in any kind of semblance of logic. Let's say, for example, you are a very corrupt Muscovy, and you go ahead and annex the Merchant Republic of Novgorod. Now, this is probably going to annoy the people of Novgorod, and this is represented in EU4 by this mechanic called rebels. So let's say you're vibing in Novgorod, and you've just been conquered, you're pretty unhappy, you have some separatism, you're like annoyed at this whole situation, you want to rise up, but oh, would you look at that? Because in Muscovy you're so insanely corrupt, you're actually fine with it. You're fine with your Merchant Republic way of life being destroyed and being basically re-enslaved as a peasant, because the person doing it is really, really corrupt. What? Like, no? Like imagine another version of this. You have some Merchant Republics in Milan or Genoa, and then the super corrupt French come along, and they conquer it, and they're really corrupt, so they don't rise up. Like, how does corruption prevent unrests? Like, your nation is really corrupt, your king is stealing loads of money from the peasants, or wherever else he's stealing it from. So the particularist revolt fails to fire because of the corruption? No? If anything, living in a very corrupt state should increase your unrest, because more people are unhappy with the whole, living in a corrupt country situation. But okay, that's fine, we'll move on. Foreign spy detection, okay, so it's easier for spies to spy on you because you're corrupt. That at least somewhat makes sense. And it's harder for you to establish spy networks because you're so corrupt, so all your spies getting bribed away. Okay, fine. All power costs 100% is the reason you don't want corruption, because all power costs is pretty brutal and you don't want this modifier. But okay, this can kind of be explained with the understanding that because you're so corrupt, it's very hard for the government to actually do things, because every time it makes a decision to, let's say, develop a province, it needs to spend more resources doing so, because every time it does so, things get skimmed off the top, and hence it fails and needs to invest more resources in achieving the same goal as a less corrupt state. So that one I'll give them a pass, but still a bit of a weird one. I guess it's more to... It may be seen as something like development costs, but that doesn't mean that all actions of the government that are allowed by mana points are, well, susceptible to corruption to some extent. Like, again, it's kind of a weird one, but all power cost affects pretty much every single monarch point interaction. And I'm not gonna lie, I don't think temples become harder to invent because the country's really corrupt. I guess it's meant to represent the lack of scientific progress and how that's harder, but even then, the way it's done is weird. I would have preferred it would do something like tech cost, dev cost increases, and more specific things than just flat or power costs. But I was feeling if they would do that, then it'll probably be less respected as a modifier, and paradoxically doesn't want you to have high corruption. It also gives you loads of minimum autonomy, which is okay. I guess it's hard to be a super autocratic person enforcing direct rule of an area if you're really corrupt. Even if you are really autocratic, then yeah, people that in a very corrupt society, people are just going to steal from you anyway. So that gives you effective autonomy, but it's not real autonomy. It's more of, yeah, you have direct rule, it's just the money doesn't, it's not that the people are more free to do things. It's not really autonomy. It's more like a lack of income from the provinces. People are drafting avoiding your drafts because you're getting 50% less manpower, 50% of people are draft dodging, and you're getting a lot less money from your taxes because people are finding ways to avoid them. But then we have to... I don't think tax avoidance is exactly a symptom of high corrupt societies. Or, well, I guess it can be, but then we start entering the whole what actually is corruption rabbit hole again. But okay, sure, minimum autonomy from corruption, that's fine. Mandate decreasing, okay, this is where I'm going to say, fair enough, this makes sense. Your mandate should go down because you should have less of right to rule because you're a corrupt government. Fair enough. But then why does your monthly air claim increase? Why do your people go and say that your son has a better right to rule because you're really corrupt? No, no, he doesn't. If anything, what high corruption should do is decrease your legitimacy, your right to rule, because you're allowing all of the theft to occur in your country. Like, what? Like, it should also be devastating for Republican tradition, but it isn't. Which goes to show that Republics are perfectly happy with chronic theft, which I guess also can make sense in the 15th century. But it shouldn't make you a more fit candidate to rule. The people shouldn't respect you more because of your ability to steal from them. That's not... No. And then finally, it gives every single state up to 10% scaling loyalty equilibrium. Because I guess they're happy they can steal more from you in the process. I don't know why, but it's such a weird mishmash of modifiers and things that give you corruption. It's very whack. And let's talk about things that give you corruption. First of all, unbalanced research. What? Why? Are we trying to say that Russia was a really corrupt society because they didn't research naval technology? Did Russia getting a warm water port and researching how to make boat by, Peter the Great going over to the UK and saying, hello guys, how do we boat? And then figuring out diplomacy technology fix Russian corruption? What? No? Why does technology or having an unbalanced level of technology have any impact on corruption in any sense? How does that make any modest... What? No. No, bad paradox, bad. Back into... No. No, back to the coding flaw. Why does unbalanced research give you corruption? Now, I kind of see why they would do that. There are certainly situations where you've, let's say, transitioned past the need for any more diplomacy technology. Namely, once you've grabbed imperialism and vanilla, you don't really take any more diptechs at all. The reason you do still take diptechs is to avoid the corruption penalty from unbalanced research. But if there was a corruption penalty, you probably wouldn't do it. What I would suggest, though, is probably adding some kind of tech cost that scales instead of the corruption penalty for technology cost, because that would actually incentivize you to take other technologies, and I guess would make a bit more sense. Like, you're neglecting an area of technology, which is making it harder for you to go forward in one specific area. Like, the lack of innovations inside the diplomatic area is hindering your ability to make administrative progress or military progress, and so on and so forth. Why does unbalanced research give you corruption? I mean, it does indirectly, because unbalanced research means that indirectly you get increased tech cost from the old power cost. But then we have to make like 3 jumps of logic there to get there, which is kind of a weird one. The other thing that we have to then talk about in terms of our big generator for over-corruption, and this is usually the one that hurts the most, is when you've just done what I've done right now with the console and you've conquered a bunch of land. Overextension gives you a lot of, well, yearly corruption tick, namely 0.51 from being 100% overextended. This does mean that when you hit over 200% overextended, you also can't root out corruption, because you're going to be getting more than the maximum -1 from rooting out. However, this makes absolutely no sense. Why does being overextended and giving your administration more land that is trying to integrate to your land give you corruption? The argument, I think, put forward would be that if you've taken over a lot of new territories, because those new territories are under new administration, this gives you more opportunities for the officials of the area to steal money, basically, and, well, enrich themselves at the expense of the people living there and so on. Because, again, there's more opportunities to corruption in this environment where the state has not, like, established itself, if that makes any sense. The issue, of course, is that that kind of logic can apply to pretty much every other situation where you're just vibing in the game. Let's say you're doing really bad as a country and are really poor. Well, the poverty and dissolution in the country incentivizes corruption because people have not a lot to lose and everything to gain. Poorer countries in general tend to get a lot of corruption because the poverty creates an environment for profiteering, for lack of a better word. You know what else creates an environment for profiteering? Extreme wealth. If there's a lot of money sloshing around, skimming just a little bit of the top can make you very, very rich indeed. In a weird, perverse way, also meaning that if you're doing really well, you should be getting yearly corruption tick. So, if you're doing mediocre, you shouldn't be getting corruption, but even then, this is just a show of how there's, leaps in logic being made here. Just because I've justified why you should be getting corruption from when you're really poor or while you're really rich, doesn't mean that you should actually be getting corruption. That's not a fun game mechanic in any sense. But then neither is gaining yearly corruption from overextension. That also doesn't make much sense at all. We've just arbitrarily said that at this point, okay, we're allowed to gain yearly corruption from being overextended because we've given opportunity for theft for when we've, expanded our administration to be bigger. but we also don't talk about how being richer gives you an opportunity for stealing, or how being poorer gives an opportunity for theft as well. Like, no, okay. I mean, the thing is with humans is that we're really good at skimming off the top. We're gonna find ways of skimming off the top in any environment, and just single-handedly picking this arbitrary example of being overextended as a major source of corruption gain is arbitrary at best. This is basically just a crutch of we need to make overextension more punishing for the player. How do we do it? Corruption's a bad modifier. Let's shove corruption in there, right? Like, what? Okay, sure, that's a thing though. That's another way of getting overextension. The next one is religious unity. Being religiously disunited makes your country more corrupt. What? No. It's you don't. We. The Ottoman Empire was not more corrupt because there was a bunch of, well, Christians running around inside of it. Religiously diverse societies don't gain corruption because they have religious diversity inside of them. That's not how that works. No. What? Why does religious unity give you corruption debuffs? I'm under the impression, again, is that below 100% religious unity needed to give some kind of debuff for, well, being there. So they gave you some increase to making your country less stable in terms of stability costs, and they made the unrest a little bit higher generically, which, okay, makes some sense, but they thought that probably wasn't punishing enough for having basically reduced religious unity, so they wanted to make it more punishing by giving you some yearly corruption tick. But it feels like just a time when Paradox decided, okay, we need to make a modifier more punishing, so we'll just throw some yearly corruption there, instead of just thinking, how is this actually causing yearly corruption? Like, no, this isn't a thing. Even justifications here are weird. What? Because we are Muscovy and we're Orthodox and we've conquered a bunch of Catholics. Suddenly our countrymen start stealing more? Like, what? Because we've taken a church in Poland, the people in a church in Kazan start stealing more money from their local church? No, they don't. The people in Kazan who are going to church, or the priest who go to church, or whoever, or like the local government official in charge of Kazan, does not suddenly become more corrupt because the Russian state has annexed a church in Poland. That's not... No. Alright, I need to really calm down. But the problem is I can't calm down because we're about to talk about the next big thing. So you have to get rid of my corruption for this one. And we can gain corruption by debasing currency. What? No. Decreasing the amount of gold inside your currency does not make your state more corrupt. That's not how that works. It has loads of other consequences, but when America went off the gold standard, they didn't suddenly gain 100 corruption, as much as libertarians would love to tell you. That's not how that works. The people in your country don't suddenly start to steal 10% more money because you decrease the amount of gold inside your currency by 10%. The gold content of your currency has very little impact, frankly, if any, on the amount of corruption in your country. Why is this a thing? I guess they wanted to add a way of debasing your currency without adding a gold percentage content on your currency, which would have been quite complicated. So they instead went for a system where debasing your currency gives you corruption for whatever reason. In essence, turning the debase currency button into a loan plus, which, okay, is great if you ever need extra loans or are trying to fight a death war or something, but otherwise makes absolutely no sense. Why does gaining corruption from debasing currency exist? It doesn't make any sense. Again, going off the gold standard or increasing the amount of other metals inside your currency, aka debasing them, so removing gold and silver from your currency, does not make your country more corrupt. You can make the argument that a corrupt ruler would debase the currency, but even then, that's kind of a weird state to be in. It also means that if you're already at 100% corruption, you should be automatically debasing all the time. But no, you stop debasing at 90% corruption, which I guess makes somewhat sense from a game balancing point of view. Which again is weird, but the thing that we also have to bear in mind is that because debased currency is practically just a reskinned loan in the current version of the game, rooting out corruption, which we're going to touch on, the way that works is that scales with your income. But debased currency scales with your loan size. And this is where we get some interesting situations coming in. Normally that means that if you have really low autonomy, you would lose money because you'd gain less money from debasing than you would from the amount of money you'd need to spend debasing. But if you live in an environment with massive autonomy everywhere, so you have loads of high autonomy, so loads of development, but not any real development, and for those unaware, real development is basically development multiplied by autonomy. So if you have 100 development with 90 autonomy, you actually have 10 real development because your 90% of that development isn't contributing anything. Because loan size is tied to development and not real development, what that means is that if you have a very large empire with loads of autonomy, you actually profit money from debasing because you gain more from that debased currency tick than it would cost to root out the corruption. It's a really weird one, and honestly, I don't know what's going on there, and again, I'm just still mad that adding more like tin to your silver coins makes your corruption go up. Like, no, it doesn't. The gold standard isn't some bastion of corruption-free influence. Let's not have these delusions, please. With that, though, we move on to rooting out corruption. Now, there's even a joke I like to have among with my friends when I play EU4, and that is that when we have corruption, we need to spend loads of money, because if there's corrupt government officials, what you want to do is you want to take money from the state and give it to them, and that makes the corruption go away. As in, we are bribing our officials to not be corrupt. No, you don't root out corruption. You root out corruption through societal reforms that jeopardize the stability of the very fabric of society by identifying corrupt institutions, destroying them, and rebuilding new non-corrupt institutions, for example. Getting rid of corruption in practice in reality is incredibly expensive, yes, but also incredibly society destabilizing endeavor. Basically, having the corruption slider anywhere above, like here, should give you 50% stab cost. Unfortunately, because it's, well, a slider, that means that if you ever were to actually stab up, and the way that stability works in this game, having the slider like here and then giving you stab cost means that you'd probably just put it down to 0, stab up, and then put it back up. So I see why they've done it from a game balance point of view. It's just from any kind of making sense point of view, this is terrible. Because you can't just spend your way out of corruption. Let's think of some historical examples of really corrupt countries. Those countries can't just spend more tax money to get rid of their corruption. That's not how that works. They need systemic reform to, well, abolish the corruption from the top and start enforcing anti-corruption actions from the bottom. It is a whole process. You can't really just do that by throwing money at the problem. That's probably going to make it worse. Giving money to your government officials that are telling you about the corruption until the government officials stop telling you about corruption is just incentivizing your government officials to go from, hello, yes, we have 50 corruption. Oh, you gave me 5 grand? Okay, we now have 49 corruption. Oh, you gave me 1 million? Oh, we have 0 corruption, trust me. No corruption going on in that country, absolutely. But you still have to give me 1 million a year just to make sure we root out that corruption. No, that's not how that works at all. And rooting out corruption has no detrimental effects on your stability or unrest of the nation. Well, not unrest of the nation, but basically internal stability of the country. Because you're basically trying to, in practice, reform institutions, and that's not a very stable thing to do. Having the root out corruption slider high should, if anything, massively decrease the loyalty of your estates. If we're arguing that the estates are super happy from having 100% corruption, they're getting that plus 10 loyalty equilibrium, having really high root out corruption like investment means they should be really mad at you because you're basically destroying their ways of stealing money from you. But again, that's not a thing that's happening. You're just losing money generically into the void. No, that's a terrible representation of that mechanic, and I think that's just something I've been saying a lot today because it's true. Now, the next thing we have to talk about is the passive decreases in corruption. Oh lord. Having +3 stability decreases the corruption tick. It gives a bunch of other things, like making your missionaries more active and decreasing some unrest, and giving a very sad 3% global trade power. That is a very sad modifier. I'd argue it should be giving +5% a level at least instead of +1. But quite a few mods actually changed that already to make that a thing. But yeah, it gives you minus 0.06 Yeti corruption. First of all, that is pretty much an irrelevant amount of Yeti corruption to have. Minus 0.06 Yeti corruption may as well not be a thing, but it's technically there and incentivizes and says that a stable country is inherently a less corrupt country. No, a very stable country, if anything, means that the corruption that's already established is harder to root out, because people tend to value stability, because turns out people don't really like massive upheavals and risks and the unknown. So if there is a stable, corrupt society, people are probably going to be unhappy about you trying to reform institutions because they see the stability those institutions have brought them, even if they're corrupt, and be unhappy about that process. So trying to make reforms in a very stable country is a harder endeavor, or anti-corruption reforms, if that makes any sense, than it would be otherwise. So if anything, high stability should increase root out corruption cost. I'll give you some yearly corruption decrease. I would argue that more stable societies kind of tend to be more prospering, and in the EU4 that's represented by the fact that if you have +1 prosperity, well, on stated land you're getting prosperity tick. That's great, that's fine, no complaints about that mechanic. But prospering states means that there's more room for corruption. Having more money flowing around the area means there's more opportunities to skim off the top. And once you start skimming off the top, it's very easy to skim a bit more off the top and a bit more off the top until you're skimming 50% of the money off the top, if that makes any sense. So, no, high stability does not give you a passive decrease in corruption. You know what else doesn't give you a passive decrease in corruption? Being ahead of time in technologies. Because Muscovy invented the pike square ahead of time than it should have historically, does not make your government officials steal less money. I'm sorry, can we make any semblance of sense out of that? You're a corrupt official, vibing in, let's say, Novgorod. because again, we just conquered Novgorod, so we gained some corruption. So you're appointed like tax collector of the Novgorod province. You're quite corrupt, you're skimming off the top, and then news reached you. The state of Muscovy have invented the marketplace. And you become less corrupt passively every month, so you just lose corruption every month because we know how marketplaces work. But then news dawns to you that actually marketplaces are not that impressive of an invention. They're no longer ahead of time, and then you stop being impressed by marketplaces and go back to stealing at your previous rate? What? No. Being ahead of time in technology does not give you decreases in corruption. If anything, being ahead of time in technology means that your technology departments are really well funded, so they have more opportunities to invent things. But really well funded government departments are ripe opportunities for corruption, because you can, again, skim off the top. Where there's money, there's opportunities for corruption. So, yeah, no. In essence, basically every single way that corruption works in this game is just inverse of any kind of normal sense or understanding of how corruption would be in real life. They're completely uncorrelated sources of corruption gain and corruption loss, and frankly, this mechanic is just a hot pot of random shenanigans thrown together in a way of how do we make this worth for the player, but also make this make some kind of sense that is not consistent in any form throughout its implementation. Corruption overall as a mechanic, I would say, needs a complete rehaul, and if anything, should be changed to such an extent where everything that gives corruption gives other modifiers instead, because, yeah, let's be honest, what we currently have now makes absolutely no sense. Anyway, that is all I have time for today. A big thank you to all the people that supported me over at Ko-Fi, with a special thank you to Ark and Solar.